This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Today, we have a really great episode. Mustache Chris and I are featuring one of the best and most exceptional cult classic sci-fi movies of all time, They Live from 1998. This is a movie that honestly has aged like fine wine, at least in my opinion. It is better now than it was when Ronald Reagan was still president and Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up was on the top of the pop music charts. Let's explore why They Live has become a cult classic with such staying power. They Live is based on a very short story from the 1960s called 8 O'Clock in the Morning by Ray Nelson. This story is really fun, and you can read it in about 10 minutes. It's that short. It's only about 8 pages long. Now, Chris, what has drawn you to this movie?
I grew up and I watched it and I really enjoyed it. I always thought it was a pretty smart popcorn movie, really, because you can just enjoy it for, the classic one-liners, which are pretty famous, where Roddy Piper's coming into a bank with a shotgun saying, like, I'm come here to chew bubble gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubble gum. And, like you guys had listened to the previous episodes, and, I'm a wrestling fan, so I was excited. I was really young when this movie came out, but like later on, I was like, oh, that's Roddy Piper. I got to watch this. And a little tidbit of information. Apparently Vince McMahon was none too happy with Roddy Piper doing this movie because it had nothing to do with the WWE.
That's interesting. I always thought of that. This movie, I was young when it came out too, and it was one of those movies where my older brother and I snuck and watched it when we weren't supposed to. And I thought it was really surprising that Roddy Piper was in it, even back in the day, that it seemed very not wrestling. And that would have been nothing that I would have been able to express in words, being probably in the single digits, 8, 9 years old when the movie came out, maybe 10. But I can clearly remember that it was odd that Roddy Piper was in this kind of movie.
Yeah, I mean, well, we will get into his performance later. I mean, to me, it's a little unfortunate that he, didn't take it more seriously and practice his craft, because you see that there's the foundation for a really cool, kind of funny action star here. And he didn't really do much after this, really. I looked it up. I think he did a couple movies. He was on Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But other than that, he didn't really do a whole ton.
It's funny too, because I watched it this time with my wife, and her initial reaction was like, he sucks. And if you think of it, in a lot of ways, he has moments where he could be superb, but then there's a lot of moments in the movie he just falls flat. And it kind of I'm sure this will come up as we talk. The movie kind of fluctuates between a really serious drama to a kind of a hokey action movie. And I think a lot of that depends on how Piper performs in it, especially when you consider some of the other actors. They were really serious actors. David Keith, Keith David, rather. He was still relatively new, but I mean, he's a great character actor. Raymond Saint-Jacques, at that time a veteran character actor. There's some of the other people in there, like Meg Foster, really well-established actors, and then they put Piper in there. I wonder if John Carpenter was maybe trying to I don't know if we're allowed to use groom anymore, but if he was trying to maybe set him up to be more of a serious actor.
From my understanding, he met him at, I think it was WrestleMania 7. Because, I mean, it's not surprising to me that John Carpenter would be, I don't know how big of a wrestling fan he is, but he probably watches it. Apparently, he met him at WrestleMania 7 and they hit it off, and he'd been wanting to work with Piper since the day he met him, right? Because a lot of people think, like, I don't know, because the budget was so small for this movie, like, oh, they couldn't afford Kurt Russell because Kurt Russell was a big star at that time. But from everything that I read and from my understandings, no, this is John Carpenter had always wanted to work with Roddy Piper. And you see a lot of I could see a lot of similarities between him and Kurt Russell.
I found it really interesting, even at the time, and since I've watched it, since 1988, Piper was he was 100% heel wrestler, bad guy, and then they put him in this kind of working class man, good guy. I wonder what John Carpenter was thinking with that, because it was clearly, and I mean, even at that time, was Piper really, he wasn't an A-list wrestler. He was one of the bigger names, but he certainly wasn't the Hulkster or anything.
No, he was up there, right? In terms of like one of the top heels in the company at one time, but he had played the good guy too. He used to go back and forth, and no, he was never a top guy, but I'm sure if you go on the street and you ask, Roddy Piper, maybe half the people know who you're talking about. So that's nothing, to just do away with in terms of wrestling, which is kind of a niche audience. If you can go on the street and half the population's like, yeah, I know Roddy Piper. He's the guy that wears the kilt, right?
Yeah. It's funny, though, that by just casting Piper in that role, Roddy Piper, that you're John Carpenter was painting himself in a corner in a way, but the movie gets itself out of that corner. I think you buy Roddy Piper as George Nada, the everyman, hard on his luck, who's just trying to do right.
Yeah, well, I mean, Piper plays that to a T, in my opinion, and then like even I had mentioned it to you. I'm into bodybuilding and I do a lot of weightlifting and stuff like that. Like Roddy Piper, he looks like just a fit working class guy that like does construction and maybe works out a bit, right? Like he looks the part. He embodies it.
I'd love to start in that very first scene. I love the first scene. It's got that downbeat music, depressed music. Piper is walking, George Nada is walking through the rough part of town, clearly, and he's walking down the tracks, and they don't even have to say a word. They don't have to have anything on the screen, and it just screams that this is a depressed time. He's a depressed person, depressed economically, depressed psychologically. What did you think about that? Just that very beginning opening scene.
I think it sets it up perfectly. Like you pointed out, it sets up perfectly that it hasn't, like, it's not post-apocalyptic, but like things are not good. And, we find out later that Roddy came from like Denver, but I mean, he really could have came from anywhere, right? He's kind of like a vagrant / homeless person. I don't know. He probably hitched trains to get to LA. I think it just sets up at least the first half of the movie, the feel perfectly.
Even in that first, we get that exposition that vagrancy in this world is not necessarily a small thing, that there's a lot of regular people who have been put hard up on their luck for economic reasons. And it's just a generally depressed time. And I found it really interesting because if you put yourself back in the late 80s, we were kind of that was around, this movie must have been produced around the time of the Black Monday, I think it was, the big financial crash of the late 80s. And there was just this general malaise of maybe the good times aren't going to roll forever. And that's why I love this movie, because even though it was made in 1988, I don't feel it doesn't feel particularly dated to me at all. And like I was saying in the introduction, that it ages like fine wine. Every time I've jumped into this movie, I feel a connection to it in the time I'm at. And I think that as we're recording it now, you can hardly not feel that the movie is relevant to today, that, terrible economic times, so much homelessness, and it's way worse than anybody could have ever imagined in 1987, 88. And that's why I feel like if people watch this movie today, you would get drawn right to that point.
Well, you mentioned the homeless encampment in the movie. I go, if you look at LA right now, it's streets and streets and streets and streets of it, much of Southern California, like to the point where like people have like double-decker homeless houses now, and they've got like jerry-rigged electricity up. It's really, you know what I mean? Like it's really bizarre.
Where I live, there's encampments of homeless people that, they've cleaned it, some of it up, but it was under a certain highway. Every single overpass had an encampment with probably scores of people under it, just for miles and miles and miles and miles. And they've done some things to find people housing or shift them to other places, but it's much worse than anything was in the 1980s. Now, some of the themes to this movie, I think, to me, the biggest theme is that one guy can really metaphorically and literally open his eyes beyond his situation. Initially, George Nada, Roddy Piper, he just wants to work. That's all he wants to do. And he gets bounced around from one place to the next. Obviously, he moves from Denver, and whatever is going on in LA that we can see that's pretty terrible. Whatever was going on in Denver was worse. And he moves to LA, and all he wants to do is work. What did you think of that?
I think they set it up perfectly. Like America's kicked Nada around. He's having to move around. He's living in a homeless encampment. He's doing hard physical manual labor jobs. The one cool thing that they did in the movie, he's talking to the foreman once he finally gets a job in LA, and he's like, well, this is union work. And he looks at the union guys, and the union guys are all just standing around there. So he can't get into the union. So he has to like work underneath the table. Despite all of that, though, there's a moment between him and Keith, right?
Frank Armitage,
where they're talking about America, and Nada basically says, like, if I work hard and I keep my nose clean and I follow the rules, I believe in America. She'll work out for me. And it's interesting, the contrast, because Frank is initially the one telling him, it's like, well, this whole system that they have set up is just made to screw you over. Just keep to yourself, and keep your nose clean. And he's very jaded about the system, where Nada doesn't seem to be as jaded with the system, and who ends up seeing the truth. Really, it's now. I thought that was interesting, the way they did that.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. That's what I think was what John Carpenter sets up so masterfully, is that Frank Armitage, he's a little bit more cynical, but in a way he believes much more than Nada does. because he's the one who says he's just going to walk the white line. He's just going to follow the rules. And if I follow the rules, I do what I work hard, I'm going to be successful too. And a lot of, he might be on the surface a little bit more cynical in a lot of ways. His life circumstances have said to be more cynical. He hasn't, a part of the exposition they have in their conversation is that, Frank's family lives in Detroit and he hasn't seen or heard of them in 6 months' time. So sure, you're going to have a little cynicism there, but he's more embedded in the system than Nada even is.
Yeah, for sure. But I thought it was kind of fun the way they set it up, because initially you're thinking like Frank's obviously going to be the one that sees the truth or whatever. He's in the poster, it's Roddy Piper, but like they set it up because he's the one that he seems more jaded, he seems more angry, he seems more cynical, or Nada is just like, oh, I'll just go with the flow and like America will treat me right. I just thought that was interesting the way they did that.
So the theme of the probably the core theme of the movie is people who finally see society for what it is. And you can go down any conspiracy theory road it is, but I mean, we use all these terms now, red pilled and this and that, and we've been saying back and forth that maybe it should have always been called putting on the sunglasses of. And I mean, when we call it, even in people who say they're woke, that they've woken up, and in the movie they call it waking up. There's always this thing and this theme that runs through society, and I don't care if it's right, left, or whatever, of seeing things for what maybe they really are. And what did you think of the way they set that up in the movie?
I thought it was brilliant because Frank goes in and, like we pointed out earlier, says, "Oh, I believe in America," right? But then he starts noticing some things at the church, and he watches when they're at the
George does.
Oh, sorry, yeah, George, yeah. He notices like some things at the church, and at the encampment they have like a jerry-rigged TV, and this guy starts questioning. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of like the process of putting on your glasses, where nobody just picks up the glasses and just puts them on. It's a process. It's usually like one thing leads to another, or you see something or you read something, and it's one step at a time, and then finally you're ready to like put on those sunglasses. I mean, George putting on the sunglasses is he sees what the police do to the church and to the homeless encampment, and he's okay, like, I'm ready to I've seen enough, right? I want to see the truth now. And then he puts on the glasses.
That's one thing that they really weren't apologetic at all about in the movie, is portraying the police in an incredibly negative light. And that was something, I don't know if that was maybe something people were more comfortable in the 80s with, but I think that a movie that portrays the police in such a negative light would not be made today.
I'm thinking like we were just talking about Narc again the other day, and I'm like, Narc didn't really make the police look all that great. And we discussed that that podcast will probably be coming out soon. We discussed not really, because like the prevailing culture right now is, I don't know, it's this weird mix of like cops are terrible, but they're also like the greatest thing in the world. Like, I don't know, it's very schizophrenic. Like the culture can't seem to really make up its mind, where like John Carpenter is coming from this from like a kind of leftist perspective. He straight up says that, right? Like this is like a critique of Reaganomics in his opinion. But I personally, the way he's directed the movie, you can interpret it any kind of way, really, in my opinion. I didn't grow up in the late 80s, early 90s, but I get a sense that criticizing cops was, I don't know, it was a lot easier to do.
I think showing that honest portrayal that the police are the arm of the state, no matter, I don't care what perspective you are, of right, left, center, up or down, the police are the enforcers of the state. no matter what you want to say. I've heard other big name podcasters who would say, oh, the military or whatever, they have their oaths, but orders are what everything is built upon in the police and the military, and people follow their orders. That's just the way it is. Well, another character development that I think they did really, really well in this movie was so that in a lot of ways, Frank Armitage, he's very similar to George Nada, but then they build up this contradiction with Holly, played by Meg Foster. She's ingrained in society. She's rich. She's got not rich, but she's very comfortably middle class in LA, maybe even upper middle class. And she has everything that George Nada will never have. And I thought that the way they set that up was really interesting.
What did you think of her performance? It was kind of weird to me.
Okay, so I guess this is the time to open that up to the movie, is that what George Nada sees when he puts the glasses on is he sees that about half the people out there are aliens. The glasses, however, filter out whatever the aliens are putting up that makes everything look normal. And so there's signs everywhere that say obey, and signs that say marry and reproduce, and other signs that say, all sorts of different things. And they also, whatever these glasses, they filter out that, like I said, a good chunk of the population is actually these really monstrous looking aliens. And I think that Holly, in a lot of ways, was acting like an alien, even though she probably had no idea that aliens existed. But in a way, she was adopting their culture unknowingly just by contact with it.
Well, and it's like, she's got the nice car, she's got the nice apartment, the nice clothes. These are all the things that the alien subliminal messaging through advertisement is telling you. It's almost kind of presenting her as that's actually a pretty smart way of looking at it. She comes across like alien, like, where like Frank and George are very like working class, and I don't know, it seems like in this movie, like the type of messaging doesn't seem to affect them as much.
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, the messaging for them is stay sedated, stay subdued. All those people in the camp who are just sitting there watching TV all day long, even they're not even working. And it's keeping George and Frank subdued. They're just going to work, doing their thing. Holly, she just happens to have a better job, and she's doing all the things that the subliminal messages are telling her to do.
Yeah, it's just showing like this is like the upper middle class version of following your orders, and the lower class version is, drink beer and watch the television.
When George puts on the glasses, he almost goes on a killing spree. And my mind went to, what if the movie is actually trying to say that George is just a psycho and he's seeing this in their mind? Now, eventually, very soon afterwards, the movie makes it absolutely clear that these are 100% aliens. It takes away any of that ambiguity. But what do you think about it if the movie was supposed to be have moral ambiguity? Maybe this guy's a psycho. Is that something that would have been completely out of the what this movie was really going for?
I think it would, with this movie, like the way John Carpenter shot it is like a fun popcorn movie. Yeah, I don't think it really would have fit, because George is just supposed to be the Stallone hero, the Arnold Schwarzenegger, Kurt Russell type hero. But I was thinking about this during the week after watching this movie. Like, I want to see that movie where you don't know whether Roddy Piper's insane or not, and like the end is you find out that he is insane, and then they like re-show some of the scenes from this movie, like but how they actually happened. And you see like Roddy Piper goes into a bank, and you initially see it as like the fun kind of scene in the movie, where he's like dropping one-liners, and then like
Yeah.
you start realizing he's insane, and then it like cuts to like just horrific carnage and violence, and you see, I shouldn't laugh, but like Roddy Piper's just smiling, dropping one-liners, and it's like, oh wait, this guy that we've been cheering on the entire time is actually insane.
All those scenes where they show him where he kills one person who he sees as an alien through the glasses, but then he doesn't kill somebody else. And then you look and they just really are humans with regular blood. And I think that could have been that was not this movie, because I think the real crux of the movie was really disadvantage and what we might call in today privilege, that there's certain groups that are privileged. It really is more, if you want to look at what the deeper meaning of the movie is that it's economic privilege more than it is looking at the conspiracy theorist, which really, I mean, back in the late 80s really wasn't a thing yet.
No, it was just kind of starting. It didn't really take off until, I would say, like the early 90s, mid 90s, with radio and people. Alex Jones was one of these people, but there was like a couple other guys before him. I'm trying to remember there's a guy who wrote a book like To Behold a Pale White Horse.
Yeah, a lot of stuff came out, or at least it was probably out in the late 80s, but it didn't really bubble up into the pop culture really until the early 90s. Not too long after this time, but there was a lot of stuff that started to bubble up into the popular consciousness, probably in the very early 90s, 92, Ruby Ridge and those sorts of things, where there was people, who had very divergent views from the mainstream, and they came up to the forefront.
But like stuff like subliminal messaging, like they like touched on this movie in terms of like advertisement and television. I mean, I think that was, I don't know if that was mainstream, but people were definitely talking about it.
Yeah, it was probably about that time where subliminal messages, people were talking about that.
And I think that's generally accepted now, but at that time it was considered kind of a conspiracy theory. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Like I tend to, I don't know. I'll just be honest, and I'm not going to pretend I'm like in the center or anything like that. I tend to lean right, and I will listen to. I'm more open-minded about conspiracy theories than probably some people, right?
One thing that I think we have to talk about before we move on is the fight scene, and I use my wife as a gauge for this. Usually fight scenes like that, or car chases or big gun battles, she's out. She just thinks they're so boring. She'll flip out her phone. She watched that fight scene, and it's probably about 10 minutes long. It's so long. But there's a fight scene between, and this is a movie, I just want to say it like right out. Go watch this movie. Watch it twice. Don't get spoilers from this movie or from this podcast. Go watch it. But this fight scene between Frank Armitage and George Nada is one of the most epic fight scenes. And I think you can understand this fight scene probably in like 3 or 4 different levels.
Well, yeah, the first level it's amazing. It goes, I think the runtime is 6 minutes, and it's not your typical kind of fight scene. And there's no Matrix here. There's no martial arts. It's dirty. It's gritty. It's kind of, how 2 strong working class dudes would probably duke it out. And they get tired, and then they have to stop. And it almost seems like a guy's like knocked out and he's done, but then he gets back up. And like, I like it in the sense of the reason like they don't go for the finish or what have you is because they're kind of friends. They don't really want to hurt each other. They're just very annoyed with each other at the time. And like the whole thing hinges with Roddy Piper just telling him, you put on the glasses. And that's what this is all about. He wants them to put on a pair of sunglasses. I did a little bit of research about that fight scene actually, and apparently Roddy Piper had a fair amount of say in what they could do and could not do, and he worked with the stunt coordinators because he comes from a wrestling background, right? And um Keith Davis, right? Or Davis.
Keith David. Yeah, there's another actor who's about the same age who's played a lot of roles whose name is David Keith. I've confused their names about 50 times, but so it's in this one it's Keith David. I think he was the guy. He did not Geico ads. He's really famous for one of the insurance company ads.
Well, he comes from a dancing background. And then from my understanding, he still does it to this day. And professional wrestling in a lot of ways is choreography. So I'm sure that, it's just one of those like match made in heaven type of situations for a director.
I think, like you said, it was probably, I don't know how many street brawls would go on after so much punishment got doled out between each other. But you very much get the sense that it could be just two guys who have absolutely had it with each other, and it's a street brawl. You also get the sense that the tension that Frank Armitage will not budge from his worldview, and George Nada is not going to not let Frank Armitage see through the glasses. That, like you said, that whole fight, it's just Armitage, put on the glasses, and they're one of them has to be defeated. It's almost like if you put yourself back in 1988, the Soviet Union versus the USA, somebody's not going to win this.
Yeah, I always kind of saw it as like Roddy Piper's forcing Frank to see the truth, right? And Frank's fighting it. Like he has the whole entire movie. He's like, "Oh, I don't want to cause any trouble. I got wife and kids. Like, just leave me out of this. I don't want to know anything about this." But there's a part of him that does want to know about it. And George is basically, his will to power is forcing Frank to see the truth. I think deep down, Frank wants to see, but he has to be pushed along the way. And sometimes it takes that for people to, open their eyes and actually see the truth. It takes something dramatic, like, a 6-minute long street brawl.
Can you beat somebody into submission though to see the truth? Is that really, is that a metaphor that works? Is that Piper? He could have done it. They could have played it out on a montage for 6 months. Put on the glasses, Frank. Come on, put on the glasses. Finally, just shut up. I'm going to put on the damn glasses. But they boil it down to a 6-minute fight. But you get either way. Can you beat somebody down to see the truth?
I think you can use it as a metaphor too, though, in the sense that this is Frank fighting with himself.
Oh, that's true.
To finally open his eyes and actually see what's going on, right? Because he's clearly jaded about society. Clearly knows that this is not right. That there's something seriously wrong going on here, and he's he's wrestling with himself. In a lot of ways, when somebody gets red pilled or they put on their glasses, they have to do this internal fight themselves. And it's just kind of represented with the two of them actually fighting.
I think that is really a great metaphor, is that fight was really Frank against himself. Piper wouldn't give in, but Frank wanted to walk away. And I'm probably at any point he really could have walked away. Is George going to punch him in the back of the head and make him watch it? Or make him look through the glasses? I think ultimately, if Frank had just walked away, that would have been that. I think that Frank wanted to beat George into submission, to say that, no, my worldview is the correct one, almost to prove it to himself. Like, no, I'm done with this. I'm not going to have you rocking my entire worldview. I'm going to beat you into absolute submission.
And he needs Frank to look through the glasses because it's confirmation to himself that I'm not crazy. Well, wait, there's somebody else that's actually seeing this, because up at that point he put on the glasses, but nobody else had, right? And he's his only friend in LA at the time. I mean, it's understandable. You find some truth that you're not supposed to know, or some conspiracy theory that you think is there's more truth to it than, say, the mainstream media is letting on. Or just as an example, you have to go. You can't just keep that to yourself. You got to go tell somebody else and try to convince them, like, hey, like, I'm not crazy. Like, look at this, and you try to open their eyes in a lot of ways. I mean, that's a brilliant thing that this movie does too. Like, even like George, when he goes on like his killing spree and he's going crazy, that's in a lot of ways when people, put on their sunglasses or they believe that they've uncovered some kind of truth, they do end up going crazy. And then most people learn to control it, and they're able to find outlets for it or find some effective way of spreading whatever information they believe they have. But to get to that point, usually you go through a process. It depends on, it could take people months, it could take people weeks, years, really, or some people just never get out of it, where they find this truth and their brain melts. They just can't handle it. I mean, and George does that. He goes into like a grocery store and starts, starts acting crazy, goes into a bank and starts shooting a bank up, kills cops. I mean, they're not cops, they're aliens. But to me, that's what that whole thing represents, is that once you get the truth, it's just getting the truth is not enough. You have to be able to learn to handle it, right? And a lot of the times getting the truth will make you end up going crazy.
Let's focus in a little bit about what did we really love about this movie? What did you love about this movie more than just because I think there's so much to love about this movie.
Roddy Piper's performance. I mean, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's not that great," but I think he nails it personally. I love him in this movie. Like, I don't think anyone would have been able to say some of these one-liners like, came here to chew bubble gum and kick butt, and I'm all out of bubble gum. I just can't see somebody else doing it.
It was such a classic line.
You know what I mean? I actually did a little bit of research, and it was he would just write stuff down for wrestling, like, oh, what can I use in a wrestling promo or whatever? And he's shown John Carpenter the book, and he's just like, you got to use this line. And so a lot of like the more famous one-liners in the movie is stuff that Roddy Piper came up with himself. I think Frank's character, I really liked him because he brings a certain gravitas to the role. I'm not like, he doesn't put on like an Oscar-worthy performance or anything like that. Like, Roddy Piper's so over the top and so exaggerated because he's coming from that wrestling background. He kind of gives it a little bit. He brings it down to the ground more.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. One thing that I thought that's worth talking about before we go on to maybe some more things that we really loved about the movie is that John Carpenter's his visual, or the way he visualized the movie, is a critique of unrestrained capitalism. And I think that's just wrong. I think that focusing on capitalism, it's trite, really. And I think that that's where something, when an artist makes a creation, it gets out from under them. I think it's any system. The economic system doesn't matter. It's when any sort of morality has been stripped away from a system. These aliens, maybe they have their own morality, but it doesn't line up with a human morality. That's the problem. It's not capitalism. And really, it's not necessarily, I've come along to that. It's not necessarily even communism that's evil. It's the unrestrained part and the restraint is really our own morality. Are we doing good to our fellow human being and to ourselves? Are we putting just our consumption and what we want at this second above ourselves? Or are we putting what's best for our own long-term goals, our family's goals, our society's goals?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm sure if you sat down with John Carpenter, he probably would agree with you on these points. He's a little prickly from my understanding now. But he's always been like that. He's kind of the way I've always viewed John Carpenter. He's like the punk rock director of Hollywood. So, like, I'm not entirely surprised that he wasn't a big fan of like Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics, and because those are the circles he's coming from. But I'm sure if you sat down with them and actually had it like a more serious discussion about the meanings of the movie, I wouldn't be surprised if he would have agreed with you on that.
Yeah, I think that we get maybe in America or the West, we have this dichotomy. Well, if it's not capitalism, it's got to be this or that. And we don't look at outside of that there's something, the way we balance our checks and our zeros and all of that, you can't regulate that if it's not regulated inside individual people.
Oh, for sure. And just even you mentioned economics. It's crazy to me. Like, you talk about just economics in general, and it's like, oh, what about like tariffs or trade barriers or something like that? And like, you got all the conservatives on the right saying like, oh, what are you, a commie? Or you know what I mean? Right. And then like, you got like people on the left like, oh, like maybe we should like, lower the taxes for particular groups or what have you. And it's like, oh, what are you, like a Ronald Reagan or something, like trickle. Like, it's just, I don't know. Do you get that sense? Like, I just find it so boring.
Exactly. It's boring and it misses the point. It misses the moral aspect, and wherever you get your morality from, I'm not going to talk about that, but the basic sense of how you treat people, that's not going to be dealt with with your economic system. That's not going to answer the problem.
Yeah, I guess their argument would be like the trickle down Reaganomics like sets up a system where it's all against, it's me against everybody else and everyone else against each other. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that. That doesn't, if you want to improve the economy, I just think some of it is just, common sense trade policies, maybe some tariffs. I mean, I guess we're going to get to that's the modern stuff, but do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure. I mean, yeah, that people have to come to some sort of consensus on just again, it's that there's some give or take between these things, but it's just to talk about a moral issue. The economic system's not going to fix a moral issue. That's maybe that's controversial. Now, moving on from that, what I really loved about this movie is that I think some of the same things that you liked. Piper isn't the greatest actor on the earth, but he plays this character well. I think it's cast driven. Keith David, he gives the serious professional portrayal that to me that anchors what really comes across as the amateurish acting job that Piper does. It's good, but he's not a pro. To me, Keith David and Meg Foster, they really add that professional element to it. And Meg Foster, I mean, she looks like an alien. She acts like an alien so much that I think you want to believe that she's almost one of the aliens. And then again, like Raymond St. Jacques playing the preacher, it just adds a lot of gravitas. Now, Chris, what didn't you like about this movie?
The pacing's a little wonky, to be quite honest with you. Like the first half of the movie, it's actually kind of a slow burn. And then like as soon as he puts on the glasses, it's just like pedal to the metal. And but I've gotten used to that. That's just John Carpenter's filmmaking. I've gotten used to it, but I can see why some people would think they try to cram too much in the second half of the movie, and they don't take enough time to like kind of really flesh out this world and the characters. That's just my opinion. But other than that, I really don't have many. I mean, some of the special effects, even for the time, were a little dated, but they're like the flying saucer, like the spaceship or whatever. I didn't think looked very good. All that stuff in the black and white, like the alien makeup, looked really cool. But as soon as they put it in color, it didn't look as good. But I mean, they're working off a $2 million budget. the use of the black and white was really cool too, because like he puts on the glasses, and I don't know, this is the way I've always interpreted it. Like the truth is black and white. It's either it's not the truth or it is the truth. And he sees the world in black and white.
I think that in a lot of ways, the effects, they didn't look great back in 1988. I think that they were supposed to look kind of wonky, guerrilla, that they weren't supposed to be the greatest effects.
Yeah, I kind of like an homage to the old 50s, like alien type movies. I get that. I mean, but I don't know. They're still a little wonky, in my opinion. I like them in black and white, though. The aliens look great in the black and white.
I think two things that I really, or maybe two or three things that I really didn't like about the movie. I didn't like that a lot of the character development, like you said, the pacing was, it was either too fast or too slow. That, you know, there was times where they spent a lot of time for the development and then and to move the plot along, and it just seemed to go really slowly, or then they would just blast through things. Like there's a scene in the end where at the very last scene where, or the next to last scene, the climax scene, where George Nada is blowing up the satellite dish that controls the filtering, and he leaves Frank behind, and then Meg Foster just shows up, and presumably she's killed Frank, and Frank doesn't know it, and we just have to infer that. But I don't feel like that was right to just leave Frank in the dust, and we don't know how his story wraps up. I could see in a way that we know in our hearts that she killed Frank, and that now Nada's not going to live. Whether he succeeds or he doesn't, there's not going to be a happy ending for George.
I just assume he was killed, and I mean they should have showed it on screen. I mean, there's really no reason for them to have not shown it on screen. But I find it interesting. We were talking about The Thing, and like everyone dies in The Thing, and then this movie everyone dies, and it seems to be like a reoccurring thing in John Carpenter's movies. I think it was because when he did Halloween, he only wanted it to be the one movie, and they left it open that was Michael Myers still alive or not alive? Like, and he just got really angry with the direction that the Halloween series went in. So I assume with some of his movies, he's like, well, they can't make a sequel if I kill the hero or something. So I wonder if that was his, because there's a possibility they probably could have got a couple of movies out of this.
Yeah, for sure. I think they could have gotten probably another movie out of it, but I think it would have been a terrible idea to make a universe out of it. I think that it ended the way it was supposed to. One thing that really bothers me is and I think maybe it was trying to be cartoonish, is the gunplay of, just they pick up a gun and it's, shots, and I don't ask for 100% realism, but and I think maybe it's that filming has changed to like really sloppy trigger control, where when they're not ready to shoot, they have their fingers on the trigger. I don't know. That just really irks me. Things like that, like safety concerns. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but maybe that they were trying to, with the guns and the action, that they were trying to go really cartoony with it. But I would have liked to have maybe seen it being a little bit more realistic. I don't know. That's a minor pet peeve.
I just think they were just kind of having fun with it. Like Roddy Piper, like has the machine gun in the one hand, and he's just like, I don't know a ton about guns, but I know just you wouldn't be able to hold it with one hand, and then like he like shoots it, and he literally shoots everybody with just perfectly. But I don't know, they're just having a fun. That's what makes this movie work. It reminds me of like Paul Verhoeven. I mean, John Carpenter and Paul Verhoeven have a lot of similarities in terms of their style of filmmaking, I think, and where they're able to mix fun popcorn movie that everyone can kind of enjoy and have deeper, like legitimately deeper meanings and symbolism in their movie. Like we were just talking about that fight scene, and on the surface of it, it's, it's just a fun fight scene, but like you just dig a little bit deeper. But that's this entire movie, and that's a lot of Paul Verhoeven's movies too. That's why I like both of these directors so much.
that's really that's the takeaway for this movie, is that you can view it as a really cheesy, over the top Friday night popcorn movie, but you can also dig down so deeply into this movie. And I think that that's what makes it a true cult classic, is that you can thoroughly enjoy this movie on any number of levels and really get something out of it.
Yeah. And, don't listen, like, go watch the movie. It's great. It's one of my, favorite B action movie. I don't know. How would you describe it? It's like a sci-fi. There is some like horror elements to it too.
Yeah, I think it's a classic late 80s B kind of punk action movie. It has some comic elements to it. It has some satirical elements, but it comes back to that 80s action that really it folds all that together. And I think it does it really, really masterfully. And that's why I would say this is a movie go out and watch now.
Yeah, for sure. It's just something that you don't really see out of Hollywood anymore. This kind of guerrilla style punk aesthetic filmmaking. It's just, we don't really see it anymore. Everything's so glossy and clean and perfect. It's that fight scene really just sums up the entire film. It's down, it's dirty, it's guerrilla style.